the clear, sober state of understanding the personality of Godhead, and which is generally called Vasudeva consciousness, becomes manifest in the Mahatattva. Purport. The Vasudeva manifestation or status of understanding the Supreme Personality of Godhead is called pure goodness or Sudasattva. In the Sudasattva status, there is no infringement of other qualities, namely passion and ignorance. In the Vedic literature, there is mention of the Lord's expansion as the four personalities of Godhead, Vasudeva, Shankarshan, Pradyumna, and Aniruddha. Here is the reappearance of the Mahatattva. The four expansions of Godhead occur. He who is seated within as Supersoul expands first as Vasudeva. The Vasudeva stage is free from infringement of material desires and is the status in which one can understand the Supreme Personality of Godhead, or the objective which is described in Bhagavad Gita as Adbhuta. This is another feature of the Mahatattva. The Vasudeva expansion is also called Krishna consciousness, for it is free from all tinges of material passion and ignorance. This clear state of understanding helps one to know the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The Vasudeva status is also explained in Bhagavad Gita as Kshetragya, which refers to the knower of the field of activities as well as the super-knower. The living being who has occupied a particular type of body knows that body, but the super-knower, Vasudeva, knows not only a particular type of body, but also the field of activities in all different varieties of bodies. In order to be situated in clear consciousness or Krishna consciousness, one must worship Vasudeva. Vasudeva is Krishna alone. When Krishna or Vishnu is alone, without the accompaniment of his internal energy, he is Vasudeva. When he's accompanied by his internal potency, is called Dwarkadish. To have clear consciousness or Krishna consciousness, one has to worship Vasudeva. It's also explained in Bhagavad Gita that after many, many births, one surrenders to Vasudeva. Such a great soul is very rare. In order to get release from the false ego, one has to worship Shankarshan. Shankarshan is also worshipped through Lord Shiva. The snakes which cover the body of Lord Shiva are representations of Shankarshan, and Lord Shiva is always absorbed in meditation upon Shankarshana. One who is actually a worshipper of Lord Shiva as a devotee of Shankarshan can be released from the false material ego. One wants to get free from mental disturbances, one has to worship Aniruddha. For this purpose, worship of the moon planet is also recommended in Vedic literature. Similarly, to be fixed in one's intelligence, one has to worship Pradyumna, who is reached through the worship of Brahma. These matters are explained in Vedic literature. So, this is actually a description of the aspects and elements of material creation. The chapter is called Fundamental Principles of Material Nature. So in the third canto, there's quite an elaborate description of the creation, starting from the appearance of Mahavishnu, who glances over Prakriti, which is, say, unmanifest or invisible. And when he glances and agitates it with the energy of time, he injects the jivas into Prakriti, and then Prakriti transforms into Mahatattva, which is described here in this verse. And that Mahatattva is in a state of sattva. Prakriti, which is avakta or invisible, does not manifest any particular guna, sattva, rajas, or tamas. But when it gets transformed into Mahatattva, then there's a disturbance of Prakriti and it manifests as sattva guna. Now, once the agitation takes place, then more changes start taking place. But until the glance of Mahavishnu and injection of jivas into Prakriti, Prakriti is helpless. It doesn't do anything. It just sits there for infinity. So when the Lord chooses to glance and inject jivas, then suddenly sattva guna manifests in Prakriti like this. But once that disturbance starts, it generates a whole series of reactions, like chain reactions. I don't know, maybe when you have an atomic bomb, there's a whole chain reaction of reactions, and that eventually you can get a big explosion like that. So like here, we have the first instigating, inspiration or whatever we call it, stimulus into Prakriti by the Lord's glance, and then we get Mahatattva, and that's the first disturbance. This creates further disturbance, and gradually the gunas keep changing. And then Rajagun manifests. That state is called Sutra. And then eventually Tamogun becomes prominent, and that becomes Ahankara. And then Ahankara begins to change into Sattvic Ahankara, Rajasic Ahankara, and Tamasic Ahankara. And then the Sattvic Ahankara manifests manas, or mind, and the sense devatas, like Surya for the eye, etc. And then the Rajaguna Ahankara begins to manifest the senses, like the eye and the ear, all the knowledge-gathering senses, and the action senses, like the hands and the feet. And Tamasic Ahankara then manifests the material elements and the sense objects. So we have sound as a sense object, and we have ether as an element. And we have touch and air and form and fire, like that. So in this way, when that's complete, we get all the gross elements, the sense objects, the senses, and sense devatas, and the mind, intelligence, etc. These are all the elements for a creation. And then they form into universes. And then Brahma enters into that universe, then takes all the elements, and then he makes planets, described in the 5th canto of Bhagavatam. And he makes bodies for the living entities, which is described in the 4th canto of Bhagavatam. So in this way, this is actually a discussion of the whole creation from beginning, the elementary stage here, with Mahavishnu's glance into what we call the Sarga, creation of the elements, and then later on we'll have Brahma creating the actual universes with the planets and the bodies of living entities. That's called the Visarga. And of that, the planetary systems is called Sthana, which is in the 5th canto of Bhagavatam. So in this way, there's a gradual explanation of the creation of the universe as we know it. But the main element, or the important element we have to understand here, is the glance of Vishnu. Without the glance, nothing happens. So matter cannot manifest anything on its own. We need the glance of the Lord. So we can ask, why a glance of the Lord? Why he has to look over there, Prakriti or whatever like that. Technically, our acharyas describe the glance, or the iksha, of the Lord is not having to be a physical glance, because he doesn't have physical eyes anyway, but it means his will. When he so wills it, even if he doesn't look at Prakriti, he doesn't have to, why would he look at Prakriti anyway? Simply he wills, let Prakriti begin to agitate and manifest Mahatattva, etc. So simply by his will, all of this happens. That's his iksha, his glance. So in this way, the whole cause of everything is that Mahavishnu form. And then Mahavishnu expands into Gaudaksha Vishnu within all the millions and millions of universes that emanate. And then, when all the creatures are there with their bodies, the Kshirodaksha Vishnu enters into all the jivas within the universe. So in this way, the Supreme Lord is pervading everything. He's here as Mahavishnu, overseeing the whole of Prakriti. He's within each universe as Garbhodaksha Vishnu, and he's within each living entity, each jiva, as Paramatma Kshirodaksha Vishnu. So he's actually pervading everywhere. And at the same time, he is completely untouched by anything. So that's why we describe the Paramatma was in all of it. He's actually neutral. As Krishna says, I'm sama. Doesn't favor anybody. He just looks, he's the witness of everything. He doesn't interfere. But through him, the jivas get their desires fulfilled. So, the important point is that it all emanates back to the Supreme Lord. Now these three forms are those aspects of the Lord who deal with matter. So we have Mahavishnu glancing over matter. We have Garbhodaksha Vishnu entering into it and creating Brahma. And then we have Kshirodaksha Vishnu entering into all the jivas. So this is all part of matter, which is a secondary pastime of the Lord. So these three forms are all labeled Paramatma forms as opposed to Bhagavan forms. So the forms of Bhagavan are those which exist in the spiritual world, and their only activity or pastime is their pastimes with their devotees there, not with the creation of the material world, etc. So that's why they're considered superior to the Paramatma forms of Mahavishnu, Garbhodaksha Vishnu, Kshirodaksha Vishnu. So, therefore, the origin of this Mahavishnu, he's like an expansion. He's called Mahashankarshan. But not so great because he's an expansion from Shankarshan in the spiritual world. And Prabhupada explains here we have Pradumna, Aniruddha, Vasudeva, and Shankarshan. So we've got the Chaturvyuha situated in Vaikuntha. And the Shankarshan expands into Mahavishnu, who is Mahashankarshan, who expands into Garbhodaksha Vishnu, Kshirodaksha Vishnu. So in this way, expansion takes place from that Shankarshan in the spiritual world. But where does the Sankarshan come from? Obviously, we can trace Shankarshan back to, we have in Dwarka, we have Krishna or Vasudeva, we have Balaram, who is Shankarshan, we have Pradumna and Aniruddha. So we have those four people in Dwarka. But then we know that Goloka or Vrindavan is superior to Dwarka. So therefore we can trace that Vasudeva back to Krishna and Vrindavan and Shankarshan back to Balaram. So then ultimately the source of everything is Krishna and Vrindavan, who manifests as Vasudeva in Dwarka, and then Vasudeva in Vaikuntha, and then Balaram manifests as Shankarshan. He expands in Vaikuntha, and then he expands into Mahashankarshan. So in this way, the Paramatma features here from Mahavishnu down, they're actually expansions. And if we go backwards, then we can trace everything back to Krishna. So the whole purpose of Bhagavatam, as is explained in the second canto, is to show that Krishna is the center of everything. And at the same time, there are 10 topics which are typical for a normal Mahapurana or a major Purana. Also it includes Sarga, Visarga, Sthana, etc. 10 topics are there. So this is the first topic, Sarga. Glance of Mahavishnu, creation of Mahatattva, etc. And then Visarga, that's the fourth canto with creation of the planet, the living entities, etc. And then Sthana, the creation of the planetary systems, in the fifth canto, like that. So we have 10 topics arranged in the Srimad Bhagavatam, but the 10th topic is called Asraya, which means the shelter or the cause of everything. So in Bhagavatam, that shelter of everything, the cause of everything is Krishna, who's represented in the 10th canto of Bhagavatam. So it's explained that all the other topics are actually leading to Krishna. So we were talking about Sarga, Visarga, and Sthana, whatever remarkable features we see of Supreme Lord or his result, that is the material world and the planetary systems and the living entities, etc., all the complexity there. Ultimately, we have to trace it all back to Krishna. But of course, all of this is secondary. It's the material world. It's actually not important for Krishna at all. Spiritual world is much more attractive. Why would you get involved at all? So the only purpose is because this is part of the Puranic subjects. We have to explain all this. Why do they bother anyway? It's because of us. We're living in this material world and we start asking questions about it. How does the Lord create this material world? How does he relate to the material world? Why is the material world like this? What are the elements of the material world? So, therefore, there is discussion of this, and Of course, through that discussion, we can also recognize the nature of Prakriti or Maya and its difference from the Jiva and its final cause, the Supreme Lord, which we call Sambandha Gyan, or knowledge of Tattva and the relationships between them. So that's the basic purpose. But ultimately, the more important than that is to show that everything ultimately goes back to Krishna. Not even Vishnu. Vishnu is their Mahavishnu. He's the cause of everything here. But behind that finally we have Krishna as the final cause of everything. So that's the ultimate purpose of Bhagavatam. So though there we can say it's a little bit complex to try to figure out this whole creation, how it's taking place, even though it's described about 3 or 4 times in the 3rd canto and 2nd canto. Nevertheless, we don't have to worry about it too much, other than to recognize that ultimately all these material elements are achit, or unconscious, dead matter actually, and they only get their life from the Supreme Lord. Whatever they can do, whatever power is given to material elements is ultimately given by the Supreme Lord and directed by Him. But it's all indirect because it's through the, Purusha avatars, these forms of Paramama. And they are ultimately expansions going back to Krishna. So it's only to show ultimately the greatness of Krishna, and He's behind everything. But we also know that to admire the greatness of Krishna is not the ultimate object of the followers of Lord Chaitanya. We're not so much interested in the greatness at all. We're interested in the sweetness of Krishna. So that is why generally the devotees of Krishna concentrate on the 10th canto, where we have the pastimes in Vrindavan. This is the sweetness of Krishna. So that 10th canto is the asraya, so that's the important element. And because it is the most important, therefore, many of our acharyas have concentrated on that, and they write commentaries in the 10th canto, like Sanatana Goswami and Jiva Goswami. They didn't bother to write whole things on the rest of the Bhagavatam. And Baladev also wrote in 10th canto. But of course, then Vishwanath Chakravarti wrote a whole commentary on the whole of the Bhagavatam. And there's Baladev said he did, but there's nothing there. It's only the 1st canto and the 10th canto we have of Baladev. But anyway, they concentrate on the 10th canto. And we'll see in general, not just the Gaudiya Sampradaya, but other devotees and other sampradayas, they also make commentaries in Bhagavatam. Many of them concentrate on the 10th canto again, because it's the sweet aspect of Supreme Lord, that is Krishna. So, because we are in the material world and we ask questions about our existence here, then this discussion is here. And of course, the other point is that a major Purana should discuss all of these different topics. So therefore, we're starting here with the discussion of Sarga, or the primary creation. So, just as in the material world, historically speaking, in the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, then suddenly people in the Western world began thinking, we have to be a little more objective in how we look at this world. So they began their scientific exploration of things and observing things very methodically. And then they invented microscopes and telescopes, and they developed, mathematics and physics and all these different sciences as a result of trying to figure out what is this material world. The reason is they got frustrated with the other conception of the material world produced by religion, that is Christian church, the Bible, etc. And they discovered that a lot of the things that were in there were false. The body was not like the body they thought of. They were taught the body, the heart was in a different place, the liver was in a different place, the stomach was in a different place, because they've been using the Greek model. The Christians inherited the Greek model, and so there were some things false in there also. So they just rejected the whole knowledge. Okay, we're not going to listen to spiritual topics, Bible or Scripture, church, whatever. Let's just independently look at material nature and try to figure everything else. So in the process, they reject God also. So, science is basically starting with the assumption that we can figure out everything on ourselves, then we don't need a God. So we just figure out, gravity and electromagnetic waves and whatever like that. And there's no Supreme Lord doing anything there. So that's a general conception in modern science. And if God exists, we can't prove him anyway. So, we don't discuss it. But, of course, if we look in the Bible, then we do have a Supreme Lord creating everything. And it's actually very similar if we look in the Lord in the creation, Genesis, that's the creation, then the Lord looked over the deep waters or whatever like that, and then he began his creation, so he's glancing also in the same way. And he created everything. So yes, the Lord by his will is the creator of everything. But we get more details of that here in the Srimad Bhagavatam, just how he glances and what happens when he glances. Time operates and the jivas get injected, and then all of these material elements from subtle to gross begin to manifest. But then they combine together. And then we have the world as we know it. So, either way, whether it's the Bible or in the Bhagavatam or the other Puranas, we'll get a description of the Lord's relationship with the material world. Because people are going to ask, if there is a God, then how did he create the world? Or if he didn't create the world, how could he be God? So he must have created the world. So then we have to have an explanation of why and how he did it. So all of this is explained in the Srimad Bhagavatam. But, as I said, we don't, as devotees, we don't have to get involved in the complexities too much. If we are more scientific devotees, then yes, we can start analyzing the elements and how they relate to each other and how they interact. But if we're just regular devotees, we're more interested in figuring out the relationship of the Lord with the material world. So if the Lord creates the material world, and the material world is inferior, made of prakriti and unconscious, and causes suffering for the jiva, do we blame the Lord or not for the suffering of the jiva and for all the imperfections of the material world? So the Bhagavatam is there to say, no, the Lord makes the world, and it's not imperfect. Maybe it looks like imperfect, and we don't like the suffering. But everything is created with a specific purpose by the Supreme Lord. And what we call the suffering that we blame on the Lord is actually suffering that we cause ourselves. It's not because of the Supreme Lord. So there's always an explanation of the Lord's relationship with the material world to show that he is not responsible for our mistakes. We are responsible for our mistakes. So that's why we have the concept of the jiva, who has minute independence and can be covered by ignorance. And due to the ignorance, he makes all the mistakes, and therefore he ends up suffering. So, in the Bhagavatam, we'll get a complete explanation of the relationship of God with the material world and how he creates, why he creates, and how he remains completely separate from it and never contaminated by it. So this is a problem in many religions. They can't really explain how God made a world that's imperfect or whatever, and why he doesn't do anything about it. But that we don't have that problem here with the explanation given in the Srimad Bhagavatam. It is a very reasonable explanation that is given. So that much we can take from these descriptions here, even if we don't get involved in the technical aspects of what is Mahatattva and how does it manifest these other elements, etc. At least we should understand the relationship of God with Prakriti and how he remains completely detached and not in any way contaminated by it. And we cannot blame him for any of the problems that we see manifested in the material world. He has his plan, and all of the problems come because we go against that plan. So we create a big disturbance, and then we end up with suffering or whatever. And then even the Lord is very merciful, and whenever it gets too bad, then the Lord intervenes and he comes as avatar and he fixes the situation again. So the Lord in no way is indifferent, and he wants to help the jivas in the material world, but we don't blame the Supreme Lord for any of the faults that we see within the material world. Okay, any question there? Mm-hmm. Well, that I think is the explanation in the Brahma Samhita, I think, yeah. So that Sambhu Shiva also is, we say, expansion of the Lord. And we can also say that why does he have to expand again? Because he doesn't want any direct contact. So if his glance touches, there's kind of a glance there, so he expands it to another form, which is his glance. Therefore, it's more indirect. So in that way, the whole idea of stimulating material energy to produce is rather more indirect. So that's, I think, the reason why we call it Sambhu, his glance.
You explained about the Chaturvyu and the I used to be confused because we generally hear that Krishna explains first as Balaram, and then from Balaram comes everything. But the way to understand like the Chaturvyu is it that, like you mentioned, I think that from Krishna comes Vasudeva, and so Vasudeva is still from Krishna, and then from Balaram comes Krishna.
Yeah. Well, we can say, yeah, Balaram comes from Krishna also. So similarly, Shankarshan comes from Vasudeva, I guess we can say that. Yeah? But we see in Dwarka, we have Krishna and Balaram and Pradyumna and Aniruddha there. So Vasudeva is like the Dwarka Krishna's expansion of the Vrindavan Krishna, and the Dwarka Balaram is an expansion of the Vrindavan Balaram. But ultimately, Balaram's expansion of Krishna also. But it's little. We shouldn't think of this too, materially and limit them, because actually they're all one entity. There's only one Bhagavan, and Krishna is Bhagavan, and Balaram is Bhagavan, but they're actually one Bhagavan, but they manifest in different forms like this. And there's no time when one was not there. They're all eternal forms. So Krishna in Vrindavan is eternal, Krishna in Dwarka is eternal, and the Shankarshan, Pradyumna, Aniruddha are also eternal in Dwarka. So it's not that one produces at a certain time, this one and that one, whatever. So they're all kind of eternal. But in relation to each other, we can say one is the source of the other, in the sense that each expansion will manifest slightly less amounts of the qualities, slightly less like that. So Mahavishnu is an expansion from the Vaikuntha, so therefore he manifests a little less powers. And Garbhodakshay Vishnu manifests a little less powers than Mahavishnu. Not that they don't have the powers, because they're all absolutely one, but they just manifest in their particular functions a little bit less powers as they go on and expand and expand and expand. Yeah, expansions. Yeah.
The other question is, when you explained that from the Prakriti, then when she gets agitated by the Lord, then they slowly, the different influence come into the next part.
Yeah.
And then when the elements are manifest, then the universes come. So does this mean Mahavishnu first is agitating the Prakriti?
Yeah. Then he just sits there and goes to sleep. And he sits there and goes to sleep, and everything goes on by its own.
I mean, of course, time is not really like so the universes, if brief is out, then at the moment, at the time when the elements are manifested.
Well, the elements manifest, and then they gather together, and then they form the universes. Mm-hmm.
And I like it because when I was young, I studied Buddhism and so forth, and Buddha talks about cause and effect, but he never really talks about the cause of all causes. Mm-hmm. And I thought there's something missing, so I pursued for years and years until recently I found Krishna, and he said the cause of all causes. I'm really happy. Mm-hmm. But being naive and ignorant about this whole thing, and also it's not a offense to Krishna, but Krishna is saying is, no one is equal to him, no one is higher than him. But how does Krishna exist?
How?
Yeah.
Well, when we talk about cause, not only Krishna, we can say all the Vishnu forms and the avatar forms are, because they're all one in one sense, and it's just that the Lord manifests in different forms. And they are all the cause in the sense that we can't find any superior entity beyond that. Yeah? And they're not caused by anybody else. In that sense, they're the cause. But when we call Krishna the cause of all causes, that cause is a little bit different. We're not talking about he produces, because they're all eternal. So it's Krishna and Vishnu, but we say Krishna is the cause of Vishnu, but not literally, because they're one and they're all eternal. So he's caused in a different way, and that is that with Krishna, he will manifest more of the qualities, whereas the other forms have those qualities, but they don't manifest them in that particular form like that. So in that sense, he is the cause because he manifests the qualities in full. So we give him a special position. We call him the cause of all causes. So in any case, all of these forms exist with form, qualities, and activities, but it's all different from what we see in this world. It's all spiritual, it's all eternal. And not made of matter. So everything we see here, the qualities and the activities, all related to this substance called matter, which has no consciousness and is subject to change all the time. It's not eternal. So we have two different existences. Material existence with material worlds and our bodies. And then we have another realm, the spiritual world, with spiritual entities there, and supreme spiritual entity, who's that supreme Lord, the Vishnu forms, and then ultimately Krishna. So we cannot see that world now, because we don't have eyes. Our eyes are material, we see only material things. So the process of bhakti yoga is to manifest spiritual eyes, spiritual consciousness, etc., spiritual mind, so that we can see spiritual world and those spiritual forms. How can we do that? Because actually within us we have a spiritual particle, the soul, the atma, or the jiva. So by doing bhakti, we activate that particle, so then he develops eyes to see the Lord, spiritual eyes to see the Lord and associate. What's the whole purpose of this? So that we can rise above this material realm and our identity with it, and then we don't have to suffer here, because our suffering is caused by this material identity, which is common with Buddhism also. Yeah? Material world is suffering because we're identifying with bodies. So get rid of that, and then we enter into spiritual world, and we can associate and have relationships with that Supreme Lord in the spiritual world.
So we should not think beyond Krishna.
Yeah. Well, of course, whole spiritual world is beyond the material world, and in that spiritual world, then we have all these spiritual forms, and then the most blissful form is that of Krishna. That's what we're saying. But some people prefer the less bliss, different bliss, they don't want that bliss, they want a different type of bliss, so they worship another form of God like Ramchandra or Vishnu, etc.
So what I meant is that we have to wholly accept Krishna as exists without comprehension.
At the moment, yes, we accept what Scripture says, that's all. Yeah. Because we don't know. So we accept the Scripture and the words of the sages and the great devotees of the Lord. And then we accept their testimony.
Is the Mahatattva feature energy of Krishna, is it also being passed on to Mahavishnu and also Brahmaji as well?
Oh, well, yeah, the Mahatattva is a manifestation of Prakriti, and then it transforms into Ahankara, all these different elements. And all these elements constitute the material world. So and we also see there's shells on top of the material world of earth, water, fire, blah, blah, blah. We get a Mahatattva layer, we get a Prakriti layer, which is 10 times the previous layer like this, surrounding the universe. And then within the universe, then, all the elements are also there. So our bodies are composed of all the elements. It is said, but our bodies are kind of on a lower level, so we have like gross manifestation of the elements. So we got, more of the gross elements there. And as you go to the higher planets and you go up to Brahmaloka, it says the Brahma's body is made out of Mahatattva. So very, very fine material elements there in that Brahmaloka, which is in the top of the universe, material universe.
Prabhupada says in the purpose that when Vasudeva is Krishna alone, then Vishnu is his own departed complement of his internal energy is Vasudeva. But how do you understand this? Because Prabhupada many times says Krishna is the Lord is never alone, he's always surrounded by us.
Well, yeah, that we can say is maybe just a theoretical statement. Huh? Well, when we get all of his energies around him, then he involves in pastimes, etc. But then we say the Vasudeva is also a state, like Sudasattva state. Huh? So that state is without the, we can say without the Leela, etc., whatever. Yeah. But Vasudeva is a person, of course. We associate that with either a Vishnu form or Krishna form in Dwarka. So there he actually does manifest his Shakti, internal Shakti, and has pastimes, form, qualities, activities. But as a Sudasattva state, we could say it's just without the real manifestation of those, the Shaktis.
Is internal potency referred to infinity?
The?
The internal potency which Prabhupada mentioned in
Yeah. Yeah.
Vasudeva, internal potency and Dwarakadesh.
Yeah.
Is he actually referring to infinity or
The?
Rukmini?
Oh, well, internal energy has many aspects to it. Generally, we call that the Antaranga Shakti or the Chit Shakti or the Sarup Shakti. And it's described that it has three aspects, the Sandini Shakti, Samvit Shakti, and Hladini Shakti. So the Samvit Shakti manifests the Dhamma and form, qualities, activities. And the Samvit Shakti manifests the awareness of the individuals, how we can see, we get senses so we can see Krishna, etc. All this is Samvit Shakti. And then Hladini Shakti gives us the experience of bliss in the spiritual world. And then the Hladini Shakti takes the form of Radha in Vrindavan or Lakshmi in Vaikuntha or Rukmini in Dwarka. So that one aspect of the internal energy, that Hladini Shakti takes different forms of as Lakshmi or Radharani or Rukmini, etc. Or Sita Devi also.
So we hear the statement that Prakriti sometimes is real and sometimes we hear it's false. How do we reconcile?
Oh, well, if we say it's really false, absolutely false, then that's Mayavad philosophy. There is no world, there is no jiva, only Brahman exists, so we're not Mayavadis. So when we say the world is false, it actually exists. Prakriti is a Shakti of the Lord and it's real. But when it manifests and we look at it, we're in illusion because we think it's something that it's not. So we think it's something from which we can get real happiness, but that's not true. We think it's eternal in certain forms, but they all get destroyed. Prakriti itself is eternal, but the forms that it creates are not eternal. But then we think, yeah, they are eternal, and we try to get eternal happiness from them. That's the false aspect.
We say that the jiva is, some jivas are nitya bandhas, which is basically eternally in this material world. But we also see the concept that this whole material world is actually created and then destroyed. So in terms of time, in the lifetime of Brahma, so how do we relate something eternal, which is nitya bandha, was eternally in this material world, to something which is created and destroyed at a certain
Okay, yeah. So the material worlds are created and destroyed repeatedly. So we have pralaya, everything gets destroyed, and then Mahavishnu glances again, everything's created. So the jivas continue from one creation, destruction, one creation, destruction. So in that sense, they are without beginning in the material world because Mahavishnu never has a beginning to his glancing. He's always glancing and he's always manifesting material worlds. They get destroyed, they created, destroyed, no beginning. And the jivas are all stuck in that also. So we can't say when was the first creation of Mahavishnu, when was the first jiva of Buddha, because there was a previous creation and destruction, a previous creation and destruction, and the jivas were there. So we have anadi karma for the jivas stuck in the material world. So the universes are temporary, but the jiva continues, and its karma continues through all the different creations and destructions of universes.
So is it fair to say that the jiva will carry the karma from the previous creation? And
Yeah. So though, when the destruction of the universe takes place, it's described in the Bhagavatam how the lower elements merge into the higher elements, and the higher elements, everything merges into Mahatattva merges into Prakriti, and then everything is gone at that point. The jiva is still there, and the jiva merges into Mahavishnu, but his karmas are still there. And when he comes out and goes into the universe, his karmas follow him, and then he gets a body according to his previous karmas. So the karmas are not destroyed at all. But the bodies and stuff are destroyed.
What is the first cause of Krishna injecting jiva into the...
What's the cause? Okay. Yeah. As I said, it's kind of an endless cycle. He keeps doing this over and over again. So why does he do it? Because the jivas who are just kind of resting at that point, they do have their karmas from previous existence, and they have their desires. So they're resting, but like when we go to sleep, then we wake up in the morning, and then we have our desires to do certain things. So these jivas, they're sleeping kind of and resting, but they're getting a little restless, and their desires begin to manifest. So then the Lord says, okay, you're getting to manifest your desires to enjoy in this world, so therefore I'll create a world for you. And so he sticks those jivas in with their karmas and their desires, and then they continue to try to enjoy.
I presume the universe, or started with spiritual world, I presume it started with spiritual world, become material world. And then somehow Krishna creates the material world.
Yeah.
And then inject.
Jivas, yeah.
Are they the low spirits, the jivas? Krishna don't like this create a world for them to...
So the jivas are the spirit souls who don't want to recognize Supreme Lord, don't like spiritual world. They simply want to try to get some enjoyment for themselves. So therefore they get a material world that they try to enjoy here. But even though they are like that, the Supreme Lord provides methods by which they can actually get out, get rid of their ignorance, then they can go to the spiritual world.
So how do we protect ourselves? If we go back to the spiritual,
Yeah.
how do we protect ourselves and we won't come back?
Oh yeah. How do we protect ourselves? Yeah. So, good question. So, the Lord, of course, makes a promise. If you follow the correct path, yeah, and you purify yourself and you develop spiritual consciousness, etc., then the Lord says, when it's perfect, I guarantee you do not come back here. So, once that's the word of God. But the other aspect is that once we get to that pure state, the Supreme Lord adds his spiritual energy into you. So that becomes part of the jiva, and then you can't fall into illusion again. Yeah.
Has Lord Shiva drawn the ability of destroying any nation from Sankarsana?
Yeah. That's described in the Bhagavatam also.
We hear that time is not present in the spiritual world, and time is sometimes equated with Paramatma. Is Paramatma an eternal feature of the Lord that's always manifest? Does that mean time is also eternally manifest?
Yeah, well, actually, time's part of not of Paramatma as such, because it's actually part of Maya. So it's part of the material realm, along with Prakriti, which is the gross aspect of Maya. We have the subtle aspect of Maya, like time and karma, which are not like substance, but they're actually part of the material world. So they are eternally there kind of with the whole Maya, which ultimately is related to Paramatma feature, because he glances over Maya, etc. But we can't say that he is, he expands into time as such, because it's material, so he's spiritual, it's material, so it's not the same thing. Yeah. But in the spiritual world, we say there's no material time, and that material time is a perception of a one-way version of past, present, future going in one direction that you can't change, and it's destructive. It leads to destruction of all bodies. So that's the material time. So that type of time is not there in the spiritual world, which instigates Prakriti to create, and then we get all the universes, and then the bodies created and destroyed. So, but there is another type of time which is simply which is useful for the Lord to create pastimes, and thus create bliss in the spiritual world. So therefore we have a day and a night, and Krishna gets up in the morning and he comes back in the evening, and etc. So we do have a sense of time like that, but it's all simply an instrument of pastimes for spiritual bliss.
Pointing to the earlier question, like the first time we come into the material world is when we don't want to serve Krishna. Like,
No first time because it's eternal. Yeah, anyway.
so basically, like when we want to enjoy, Krishna puts us in material world. So is there a Shastric reference for this? Because many times devotees ask, like, where is it given? Like, because of this reason, Krishna created material world.
Yeah. Well, you'll find in the Bhagavatam statements the jiva in a state of ignorance with rejection of the Lord, then he's covered over by avidya, and then he gets material bodies, etc., enjoys in the material world. We have statements like that, but we can't put a time thing on that when he first did it. Like that's all. So it's expressed in that way because there's no other way in which we can actually conceive of it. Unless we just say the jiva is covered over, and then we say, okay, it's anadi, there's no beginning to it. But when we describe it, then we have a little, we're using verbs with tenses, etc. So it looks like it had a certain time involved, but actually it doesn't. It's a continual state. Yeah.
One of the properties of the soul is insoluble. You mentioned that the jiva enters and merges in the body of Mahavishnu. Like, how do you understand that it's insoluble?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, he never loses his identity. There are certain aspects of the jiva which are inherent in him, like he has his own sense of identity, he has his, consciousness, he can be experienced, things like that. But they can be restricted. Like when you go to sleep, then you're not so conscious or whatever like that. You're not so aware. But we still have our innate consciousness and our ability to know things, etc. But it's not functioning at that point. So basically it's not functioning when it's in Mahavishnu. It's kind of like a sleep state. But he maintains his individual nature as a jiva with his own consciousness, etc.
Does the Paramatma have a loka in the spiritual world?
No, his loka is here, the borderline with Mahavishnu, and then he enters into it as Garbhodaksha Vishnu and Kshirodaksha Vishnu. Kshirodaksha Vishnu has a loka there on Svetadweep, which is in the Milk Ocean, one of those oceans around in the Bhumandala. Okay. Hare Krishna.